Breaking now, May Day violence in Paris. Riot police clash with demonstrators as division over the upcoming French election sees tempers flare.
Really, he should be in prison. He's a war criminal.
Former British PM Tony Blair's planned political comeback causes resentment at London's Labour Day rally. Also in the news, Donald Trump says the door is open for action against North Korea, while US defence contractors rub their hands over the president's recent military moves. Global News, live from Moscow. My name's Colin Bray. This is RT International. First breaking news this May Day. Trouble's broken out in Paris, where a rally's seen demonstrators and riot police involved in skirmishes in the past hour or so. Tear gas has been used as crowds grew increasingly agitated. So those were the scenes in the past 60 minutes or so ago. Let's go live to Paris now. Our correspondent there, Charlotte Dubensky. Charlotte, what kind of state are the streets of Paris in this May Day?
Well, I just want to give you a sense of that state, Colin. Just look behind me and you will see a traffic light that's literally been ripped up from the ground and pushed down as those clashes between the protesters and the police have been taking place here on the streets of Paris. We've witnessed some intense scenes with the protesters throwing rubbish and bottles, fireworks at the police, and then the police responding with tear gas. Now, I want to show you exactly what that looks like. This is a canister that the tear gas comes out of. These are shot into the air by the police. They land by the protesters. Then we see those big plumes of smoke coming up. And if you're within meters, sometimes 10 or 20 meters of any of those plumes, you get the impacts of the tear gas right in your eyes. It makes you cough. And the idea is that it helps disperse the crowds away from the police to try and stop some of those violent clashes that we've seen. Now, we have got police surrounding us everywhere here in the Bastille in Paris, as the protest now seems to have calmed down just for a few moments. But I want to take you around from those intense clashes. We're now seeing people be able to parade up the streets all the way from Place de la Republique, where this demonstration started, right the way through here to the Bastille. Now, these are annual May Day protests, people here to protest about workers' rights, anti-racism, anti-fascism, anti-capitalism, but they've also got another element to them, because we are less than a week away now from a crucial presidential election here in France. And many of the people out on the streets today say they are neither for Emmanuel Macron and they are neither for Marine Le Pen. They're unhappy with the choice of both candidates. Many people saying they may even spoil their ballots or handing blank ballots when they go to the voting polls in a few days' time. Now, the candidates themselves have also been taking advantage of this public holiday in France by basically holding rallies of their own and talking about some of their policies. Now, that's quite interesting, because we have heard from Emmanuel Macron a little bit of a rowing back on his stance on the European Union. Take a look at my report from earlier.
It does seem to be a big shift in policy. Mr. Macron used this interview to talk about his relatively short-lived political career, how the fact that he founded the En Marche campaign only a year ago. And since then, and during this entire presidential campaign, he has said and painted himself as the most pro-European candidate of all of those who stood out of the original 11. He's talked about the fact that he wanted greater integration in Europe. And what we see in this interview appears to be a rowing back on that stance.
If the day after I decide to follow up and pursue the current functioning of the European Union, I will betray my people. I don't want to do so, because the day after we will have a Frexit or we will have the Front National again.
Now, Marine Le Pen also used her rally today to criticise Emmanuel Macron and a number of his policies. She once again dubbed him to be the successor of François Hollande, the current president of France. And she talked about the idea that Mr. Macron wanted the Uberisation of the economy, the deregulation of all professions. And she said that he won't name who he would anoint as Prime Minister if he became president, because he just doesn't want to frighten voters, and he wants to gain as many people from the left, the right, the centre as he possibly can. This is what she had to say.
In this election, the system is imposing its candidate on you. François Hollande is imposing on you his protégé. And here you have Fillon's new best friend, who he once called Emmanuel Hollande. We can see Hollande leaving through the door and then climbing back through the window.
Well, protests are also due to be taking place in Paris today against that presidential candidate Marine Le Pen. There are also protests being held across France on this public workers' holiday, just a few days now before voters in France go to the polls, and it could be a far tighter race than many people are thinking.
Charlotte Dubensky there. Let's take you back live to Paris now. We can talk to human rights activist Yasser Louati. Welcome back to RT International. We're talking about the most crucial election France is facing in decades here, yet we're seeing again on the streets of Paris a huge swathe of people who desperately don't want either candidate in the Élysée Palace. Just how divided is France at the moment?
Well, France is highly polarized. The French people are given two choices, Hitler or Uber, or a neo-fascist or a neoliberal candidate without any other alternative. So, of course, given that, impossible choice, French people now are taking to the street in order to express their disarray, and that makes actually the first political party in France not for the Front National or Emmanuel Macron, but actually abstention, because they will be the ones deciding upon the election. Marine Le Pen comes with a highly mobilized electoral or with a highly mobilized voters, but Emmanuel Macron is showing up with nothing but his vision of a neoliberal France being governed by corporate money.
Pre-election promises are one thing, of course, and both Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron both say they will address France's very deep social problems. Which one is possibly winning over voters more than the other, do you think, based on what they're saying?
Actually, none of them will address the real issues of the French people, because none of them actually share the daily worries of the French people. Marine Le Pen is a millionaire who was raised as a bourgeois little girl, as well as Emmanuel Macron, who was a former banker and made his whole career in the state apparatus. Right now, it is more about one-upmanship towards the social problems of France, but what this calls for is actually for a new constitution and a new republic, because both candidates are known to be complete failures and incapable of addressing the real issues. For example, Emmanuel Macron is trying to please the left and the right by calling himself in the center, and now Marine Le Pen, after appeasing her own far-right voters, is trying to attract far-left voters who voted for Jean-Luc Mélenchon. But, we are not, naive. We know the choice is impossible. And of course, when Marine Le Pen says that François Hollande is imposing his candidate, actually Emmanuel Macron was raised by the same system that made François Hollande become president.
This time next week, though, one of them is going to be running France. So where do you think we're going to be this time next week in terms of protests?
Well, the French people have a high resentment towards the police, who have been targeting them in the marches against the labor reform, in the Palestinian marches, in the way that there are brutality in the working class neighborhoods. So that's why what's happening today is an expression of the resentment towards the police, but also the disarray for the election. But, for a few days from now, we will be facing a crucial choice for the country. My personal call is to actually block the National Front from accessing power, but then to make it impossible for Emmanuel Macron to govern the country. Nobody wants the far right or a neoliberal agenda being imposed upon us, but to actually have a more social policies, and none of them are actually offering that. both candidates are, trying to please corporate money and corporate banks, foreign entities, etc. And what's the most interesting part of this section of our national history will begin on the 8th of May next week.
Emmanuel Macron, of course, as we've been reporting, has raised the possibility of a French exit from the European Union. Do you think that's going to be enough to steal a march on some of those wavering voters who are, at the moment, still looking Marine Le Pen's way?
Well, actually, the European project is a failure. We went from a social project into a big corporation project, and that's why people have deep resentment, and these candidates are trying to say that we will renegotiate with the euro, etc. No, the European agenda has failed the French people, and that's why both candidates are trying to address this anger. But now the question, is being sent to the European Union: how far can you go into your reforms in order not to have another country leave the Union? And personally speaking, I don't think the European project is working for the average citizen in Europe.
OK, for now, civil liberties activist Yasser Louati in Paris. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you for having me.
OK, we're going to keep across what's happening in Paris with that screen in the corner there. And, of course, it's not just Paris that's witnessed street violence on May Day. In Turkey, police fired tear gas and rubber bullets at marchers as well. Security forces responded after protesters attempted to defy the government's ban on holding events in Istanbul's symbolic Taksim Square. Dozens have been arrested. That ban was put in place in 2013 when the area became a flashpoint for violent anti-government rallies. Elsewhere, though, May Day rallies have been a lot more peaceful. Some of the biggest marches in Asia were held in South Korea and in Hong Kong. While in Europe, Greece was one of the first countries to start its celebrations. Workers' unions have also turned out in force in London. RT's Issa Ali is there for us.
Thousands of protesters coming out on this International May Day, Workers' Day, and showing their solidarity with a number of countries around the world. We've seen signs saying hands off Venezuela, hands off Iran, hands off Syria, perhaps a pointer to these Western nations and their foreign policy. But of course, many people also focused on domestic issues and fully critical of the government here, particularly what they say is a government which cares more about the rich than they do about the rest of the population.
And hopefully we get a government that listens to the people rather than to, the big man in the big offices.
This government is the most, they just throw the cards into the air and see how it falls. They just have no plan whatsoever.
The government's attack on working people, and in fact all communities, is becoming much more clear.
This demonstration comes as the former Prime Minister of this country, Tony Blair, announced today that he was making his return to politics because he wants to get his hands dirty and he wants to campaign against Brexit. And again, we spoke to people here who say that his legacy means that the people of this country are not likely to take him very seriously.
He's a divisive character in politics. He's got a lot of history. No, it's not a good thing.
Really, he should be in prison. He's a war criminal.
The legacy of the Iraq War and his responsibility for the crimes of the Iraq War means that a lot of people will just regard him as someone who should definitely not get back into politics.
Very, very harsh words there for the former Prime Minister, who they say is trying to get back involved in politics to undermine Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, ahead of that election now due to be held next month.
Monday's news continues shortly. The US and Turkey are facing a clash of interests over Washington's support of a regional ally. We've got all the developments after the break.